when you go and talk to a prospect to be able to know what their key performance indicators are and what makes them successful, because now you can actually put a number to the problem as opposed to just try to get them to talk about a problem. And it speaks to exactly what you're talking about. That's a lot easier to do. So you do have to figure that out. But the sooner you can put yourself in somebody else's shoes and understand what that business looks like and gain that empathy and understanding, the stronger and better off you're going to be.
Welcome to Market Mastery, the podcast dedicated to uncovering revenue-driving strategies for sales leaders in B2B tech. All right, on today's episode, we are joined by the head of sales acceleration, Rob Beattie from ModMed. And Rob, for those who are probably unfamiliar, what do you do for ModMed?
That's a great question, Kyle. First, good to see you again. The head of sales acceleration, it's the people that report up to me are sales development team. Like, our goal is to go out into the marketplace, find opportunities, accelerate them into the business, and get the real top of the funnel management with the human being side of it. Additionally, I have some responsibilities for helping as we look at the tech stack and some of the other stuff within the organization. I'm not like a traditional sales operations person by any means, but more just the human side of how do we use that stuff. Certainly advise some of our sales leaders on some of the things they're trying to do within their purview. So try to get my hands in, or I'm asked to get my hands into a lot of different things, but really the core of it, the majority of what I do is the sales development organization, which I guess by extension is as a liaison into the marketing team as well, and how marketing and sales functions together, which I know at a lot of organizations can be quite the challenge.
Indeed. Yeah. And so we worked together really early on in your tenure back in 2020 into 2021. What's the team size now? So what does that SDR team look like?
Yeah, we are 60 SDRs. I want to say then I think we have about 9 people within the leadership team, many of whom are managers, but we also have 2 team lead positions, which are SDRs we're grooming to be the next manager, right? So my core team is 9 with then 60 SDR. I think when we started working together, we were something like 25. And last year we actually expanded it out to about 70, 75. But as we have become, I think, more efficient, more experienced, stronger at what we do, we actually found the needs that we didn't need to backfill a few roles at the end of last year, and we were able to kind of manage our headcount to where we have it today.
That's great. Yeah, I was going to say, I thought we were maybe 20s, so 2.5xing is pretty impressive. That's great.
Well, 2.5xing, but more importantly, like triple xing our results, which is the most important thing at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's incredible. And so team leads, you mentioned you have a couple of them. Why'd you decide to add the team lead role?
Yeah, so like you mentioned, when we first started and we were working together, we had a couple of managers, one of whom had come up through the organization and one who was from outside the organization. And when you look at leadership, I think you get benefits from both. You have some different perspective. I didn't come up through ModMed. I was at a different company before and had a lot of experience actually leading the direct selling sales team as well as top of the funnel, like all kinds of stuff. I had a pretty wide purview of my old job. And so I think when you hire somebody from outside, you get a different perspective, you get a different motion, you get some different ideas, you get people who challenge the norms. But what you don't typically get is somebody who is very proficient and strong at using your tools or the motion of calling into the business that you're going after. And so I think when you're grooming people from a leadership perspective internally, you get 2 things. One, it's a retention opportunity because you have people who most typically in sales development organizations, they're new to your org. People are always like, well, they're new in career. I don't necessarily say they're new in career, but they're typically newer to your org. So a lot of them have desires to grow from a leadership standpoint. And, they don't necessarily want to be bag carrying sales reps. So it provides a little bit of opportunity for that. But you also then get people who are passionate about the team that they work for, who want to see it successful, who have either experienced success or experienced challenges and overcome them. And then they know your buyer. And so they can do a really good job of coaching up people who are new to your org about, in our case, we sell to small, mid-sized medical practices. When I encountered this type of situation or this objection, here's how I handled it directly. And they have that direct experience. And I think that really helps. And so, again, a little bit of retention, but also just, I think it ups the game of the team you have. So within that 9-person organization of leaders within our team, 3 of them were people that I've hired from outside the organization, and 6 of them were people who started as SDRs with us.
That's great. That's a good mix.
Yeah.
Good diverse perspectives.
Exactly. And I'm very happy about that, right? And so it's a diversity of experience. It's a diversity on a couple of different levels too. And so it's something I try very hard to do is keep my team not homogenous. You know, I don't want the same perspectives all the time from people. I like varying opinions. I like challenging each other professionally. You know, I think it matters.
Yeah, definitely. One of the things you mentioned, the perspective of the industry or understanding the industry, you also mentioned the SDR role is not necessarily first job type roles, especially for you. And one of the things that you were already focusing on when we were working together, I don't know, intentionally or lucky coincidence, but you had recruited individuals who had essentially been customers. So if you sell to an office manager for a small medical practice, you had been bringing on office managers for sales development and eventually sales development leadership positions. So how did that happen? Were you intentional about it or was it a little bit lucky?
I love to say I'm intentional about everything I do, Kyle, but that's probably not the case in this case. I think there's a little bit of it, though. I mean, if you can find somebody with that background, we have a couple of people who were involved in medical recruiting. Our senior manager on our team, her name's Tiffany. She was an office manager for an ophthalmology practice. And so for her, that was strong. One of our highest performing SDRs last year on our dermatology team came to us from a practice. And so we have had that where a little bit of industry background, that experience of actually having done the job does help. Like you get a perspective of it that I think helps you when you connect with people because you can feel their pain, right? There's an immediate piece of, well, I know what you're going through. I had to do the same thing myself. And so having some of that perspective in the team is a good idea. I do think you can over-index on that too. You got to be careful of it. Sometimes you can get blinders for, oh, this person has experience in the industry, they'll be awesome. And it turns out that they're just so biased to their previous experience that sometimes they can't hear what other people are saying. So you got to still coach them up. You got to still pay attention to that kind of stuff. But we've definitely had some success with it.
Yeah, and it doesn't take away the requirement of certain personality attributes to be successful in sales development. If you look at Tiffany, shout out Tiffany, who's excellent. As an example, if you did a personality assessment, she probably index as a perfect fit for sales development. It just so happens that she also had this amazing experience being the buyer. And one of the things, I was just on site with a client this week, and one of the things that we were talking about in like a large group training was the irrelevance of personal opinions and how you feel about sales outreach, except if you bend the buyer. The reason why I always say is like, okay, we're selling to CISOs, let's say. So how you, a sales professional, feel about the type of outreach that you're delivering is irrelevant because you're not a CISO profile. But if you've actually been the profile, your personal opinions about the style of outreach or the method of communication is relevant and is interesting to share with the rest of the team.
Yeah, agreed completely. Like there is that value where I understand the job you're doing and I understand what the indicators are of success in that job and being able to tie that together for somebody quickly and not in a forced manner. Look, I get prospected constantly. And when I get something that's like, as head of sales acceleration, I'm sure that your value is blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, dude, you're just listing things. Like, I'm not getting anything from that. There is no value in what you sent me. Some AI tool could have generated that email just as easily. But when you get somebody on the phone, and, you know, I think back to our experience working together, you knew exactly what the problems were that we were facing. That ability to then talk to the real decision makers in my company really came through because there's an immediate confidence in, okay, these people have felt my pain. They've had to build a funnel of opportunities before. They have had to figure out how to get prospects engaged before. This is not something that this human being I'm talking to hasn't experienced for themselves. And so I love that profile. I don't directly go out and recruit it, but if it shows up, it usually gets to the top of the resume stack for sure.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And the understanding of, or at least the ability to make the prospect feel as though you do truly understand their challenges and that it isn't an AI word salad of keywords delivered in a message, to me is like, in that intro, immediately the prospect is thinking, if you don't portray that you have demonstrated expertise of them and their business and the things that they struggle with, right away, I'm thinking, for us to have a productive conversation, I'm going to have to spend at least 10 minutes educating you. And I don't want to do that. That's where you're going to get the brush off. So the early conversation pushback where it says, maybe there's something interesting for us to discuss here, but you know so little and you're coming into this conversation so uneducated that it feels like I'm going to need to teach you for 10 minutes before we can have the real call. And that's not something I'm willing to do right now.
Right. And especially in today's world, right? Like everything, we're all so busy all the time, but it's really true. It's really true. We have so many inputs coming at us that if I have to pause and teach you more about my business, about my role, for you to then be able to put something together that's actually useful for me, I'm with you. It is very difficult to find that time or to engage in further conversation, because if it's just me talking, I'm not learning anything at that point. And so we've been actually talking to our team a lot lately. I don't know if you're familiar with a woman named Beck Holland, but I think she's a thought leader sort of in our world here. Yeah. And so I saw her speak a couple weeks back at an event in Schaumburg in Blaze from the old AAISP. And she was talking about bringing KPIs to the table and just how important it is when you go and talk to a prospect to be able to know what their key performance indicators are and what makes them successful, because now you can actually put a number to the problem as opposed to just try to get them to talk about a problem. And it speaks to exactly what you're talking about. That's a lot easier to do if I have some experience and understanding of what you're going through than if I'm just really faking it till I make it, which, look, in a lot of cases in sales, you got to do that. You got to fake it till you make it. Most people aren't salespeople in the industry in which they came up through, right? So you do have to figure that out. But the sooner you can put yourself in somebody else's shoes and understand what that business looks like and gain that empathy and understanding, the stronger and better off you're going to be.
Yeah, as long as the numbers pass an initial sniff test, I think the ones that I personally struggle with is always like, we demonstrated a 7,000% ROI on the last 3 engagements. You're like, okay.
And that's what's funny. It's because that's what I'm talking about is I don't want those BS numbers, right? Like I don't make something up for me. But if you can capture really what matters to me, like, hey, doc, how many patients do you want to see a day? If those two numbers aren't the same, we should have a conversation. That's a simple way to make that something that's palatable to your user. Not, I'll help you see 10,000 patients in a day. Like, that's not going to happen, right? Because I actually find when you give people numbers that make no sense, you actually do yourself more harm than good, because they will spend time telling you why that's not true. Or in their brains, they're like, this guy doesn't have any idea what he's talking about. That's not possible for me. Like those insane ROI numbers, maybe they really are possible, but if it doesn't seem like it, that seems like magic to somebody, most people are skeptical. We live in a cynical world. And if you give me a number that I don't think is true, I'll spend more time just thinking this person doesn't have any idea what they're talking about.
Exactly. Yeah, I personally struggle with it for our business. Like, sure, I could say to you, yes, we could help improve SDR productivity by 300%. But to me, it's so minimizing because like, okay, that happened. But there are 50 other factors involved. And it's like, what is your specific influence over that? So to me, specificity is important, where it's like, we could talk about reduction of ramp time, or we could talk about a 10% improvement on a specific meeting book rate or something by having better conversations with prospects. And those things over time, with the benefit of scale and added headcount, have dramatic long-term improvements. But if you start with like this really big, crazy number, you just get the eye roll. And like you said, I agree 100%. I haven't thought about it that way. You end up having the prospects start arguing with you about how that doesn't make any sense and it's not possible. And now you're having a conversation you do not want to have.
It's funny. It's a completely off-topic story, but I used to coach football, weirdly enough, which somehow I managed to bring up in every conversation I ever have. We were not a very strong football school, and we had a guy who was like an all-American defensive end as a coach, and our defensive ends were not him, right? And he was just one time, he's like, you know what, Joey? Sometimes you just got to get in there and make a play. And I'm like, hey, Chad, Joey isn't you, man. Joey's not going to be able to do that. We've got to figure out and give him some techniques and skills. And I think for coach, it was like, how come you can't just do this? And for the kid, he's like, I'll never be that strong. And I think sometimes
he's like, I can only do 8 push-ups.
Exactly. Right. Yeah, exactly. I can't lift up this guy and throw him to the side like you could. And so I think as a coach, as a leader, but as a salesperson trying to get in front of somebody, you got to think in terms of you're going to be a lot more Joey than you are Chad, right? Like you really are going to have to overcome and be strong and learn your different things. And being able to have those conversations intelligently, I think is one of the most important things you can do as a sales professional. Whether you're an SDR, sales leader, coach of salespeople, VP of sales, talking to prospects, selling, anything, solutions engineer, it doesn't matter what your job is. You got to think in terms of, I'm coming in from a teacher mindset. I got to come in from a standpoint of, I'm not going to know what this person knows. And so I got to learn, but I've also got to be there to be able to bring that to the conversation.
Agreed. So one of the things I did want to talk about, just because it's been a while, when we engaged, it was maybe not the peak, but COVID was having a massive impact on everyone's businesses.
Yeah, I don't know if we were back into the office even. We were barely back into the office when we first really started talking.
Exactly. And selling into medical practices who were uniquely impacted, it created a lot of challenges and complexity. So post-COVID, has there been a somewhat return to normalcy on the part of the medical practices that you're attempting to engage with, or what does that look like?
I think post-COVID, a lot of people settled into a new normal and didn't even sort of realize it, right? So in our world, our buyers, our prospects, I think they've established a new working order, and I think it's pretty stable now. It is still a challenge. You saw some massive industrial or industry changes, like the rise and strength of telehealth, remote patient connections, and how people expect to be able to communicate and how people expect to be able to show up to an office and basically walk into an appointment instead of sitting in a waiting room, right? Like those things people have had to adapt to and change to. So we've seen some of that. It's interesting, back to our conversation about growing leaders from within versus bringing them from without. I actually think inside of a more distributed and remote workforce, people who have done the job are far more important. I used to be a big believer in, give me some people who are really great raw materials as far as leadership, and I'll teach them to what I need them to do within this business. But when you're not face-to-face all the time, you start to lose some of that impact. And so you need people that know the business, and now I have to teach the leadership skills as opposed to the other way around. And so you do see sales, I think, some input in or changes into how talent acquisition works, how people are working in the world today. For our prospects, we've seen some changes, but I think that's opened up opportunity. That's a conversation that you can continue to have where I now think in a lot of industries, not just ours, but I think in a lot, people did settle into a normal and maybe don't realize what are some other ways they could approach things now. Like they may have set up a patient connection way of doing it or something that they're virtually connecting with folks that is very inefficient, but it's because what they did and what they know, they don't realize how inefficient it is. And maybe now's the time to get back in front of them and have that conversation of, okay, now let's take a look at how have you been for the last couple of years? You know, now that you've settled into this, because most people, look, we find the status quo, we tend to stick with the status quo. That's human nature. That's what happens. I mean, that's why we still come across doctors' offices out there that are using paper, which sounds insane. Like it just sounds crazy in today's world. You know, I still think about, like, love my accountant dearly, probably more than I should, but since it's my mom, I think that's okay. But every once in a while, she's like, can you still fax me something? I'm like, Mom, I haven't been able to fax anything in 30 years. Like, it's just sort of one of those things where, and that's not because she's old in the way, you know, older in age and the way in which she thinks. It's just sort of how she always worked. And so when people set that norm and the way that they do things, I just don't think they go back and look at, is this efficient or not? Human beings love the status quo. We find the status quo in all kinds of ways and really doesn't change until something comes along that makes us, whether it's an internal factor or an external factor. And usually if it's an external factor, it can be somebody coming in and giving me a better idea, but you need to give me a better idea.
Do you think it's an issue of trust? And what I mean by that is I don't trust that the amount of effort that would be required for me to change will be worth it.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, trust is such a powerful word, right? Like it means so much. When you really look at almost anything, like there's a great book called The Speed of Trust, which I recommend everybody read at some point or not, which is how fast can you actually sort of build that up, right? Because it is difficult, right? It goes back to our conversation about numbers and giving me an ROI on something. If I think your number's not true, you're actually building less trust because I'm going to be skeptical of what you have to say. So I do think there's a big piece of that over time you have to help somebody see. But if at the end of the day, I make a decision because I think that you're right about it, I'm not owning that enough for it truly to be my decision. The person somebody really has to trust to change is themselves. And I think a lot of times people just lack that confidence, or, hey, look, the way I'm doing it today is good enough. There's risk in changing something. And like I said, man, most human beings are risk averse, man. We love the status quo. If I didn't love the status quo so much, I'd probably be 185 pounds, and I'm not 185 pounds. And that's because, you know what, every once in a while I like to eat a big piece of cake, and so I just go back to that status quo all the time.
Yeah, we all do. Okay, one of the other things I wanted to talk to you about that has happened seemingly more and more. I have some recency bias within our client base, but tons of acquisitions. And so you've been a sales and sales development leader at big and high growth companies for a long time. So when you're thinking about the company you work at acquiring another, let's say, complementary product that you could sell logically back into your existing customer base, how do you think about the impacts of an acquisition on the sales development team?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kyle. And like you said, I've been through that with a couple of companies. We've handled it different ways. So I've seen it from a couple of different angles where you just keep whatever's at the acquisition company rolling. You change it all out immediately. You do a hybrid and you go through it. Like, there's so many machinations. And usually when somebody does an acquisition, it's because you recognize, hey, this client base can be pretty valuable. That's the whole point of doing it. You're acquiring a piece of technology, but you're also usually acquiring a client base. And so you're like, okay, this is going to open some doors for us to sell to. I think one of the most important things you got to have no matter what is your base process has to be rock solid. Like, I've got to feel confident that if I'm going to add something to the plate of the existing people I have, that their process is strong and they can take it on. If I'm going to keep a team that was in place, I better have a rock solid process that I can help them learn and grow from and utilize. And if they have an amazing rock solid process in place, maybe I don't disrupt it. But I think that's the first thing that you have to do is truly look at the situation and say, what do we have? If this was super high growth, was it because of process, or did they just happen to have a couple of talent, or were they doing something in the marketplace to just gain bodies, to gain customers that isn't sustainable? All of those factors go in. You're like, all right, depending on if it's A, B, or C, this is what I want to do. And so I think treating each situation uniquely is very, very important. There is no one size fits all, like you should always do this or you should always do that. But I think really stepping back and doing an analysis before you make some real big, strong choices matters a lot. Can the people you currently have in place take on more? Or is it going to be a disruption? Should you build a separate small team that does whatever it is against the acquisition? And again, it depends on, am I taking this acquired product and I'm replacing it? Or am I taking this acquired product and adding it into my existing user base? Again, all of these things, all of these factors, I think have to go into place. And I think you got to sit down and look at it and say, okay, how do I map this out? If I'm going to ask my existing team to make 50 more phone calls a week because I wanted to do this, will they do it? And will it be effective? Or am I better off having a specialist person who calls into this particular thing and we're going to learn that way? One or two people, human beings. Again, size matters a lot. Like, I'm just looking in terms of smaller type acquisitions. Big acquisitions, I actually think you're more likely to keep the existing team in place because there's so much volume and stuff. Every human has a X units, let's call it 100 units of energy that you can bring to the day. If I'm now going to somebody and being like, okay, you're maxing out at 100 units of energy, but now I need 20 more units of energy from you, you're not going to get it. So now I'm really looking at, okay, well, now I'm going to get 80 from the old and 20 from the new. I'm now losing on the old. So how do I manage that? And so I said it at the very beginning, having an internally strong, rock solid process matters a lot. I think that is a piece that a lot of sales development organizations especially don't look at. One of the things we did very early on is we identified somebody on our team who was probably very process oriented. And I think that helped us build up a really good methodology that allowed us to track, manage, look at, okay, where are the stages of the pre-opportunity funnel go? And Liz is the person on our team who did that. And she was an SDR and did a great job sort of help us marshal, okay, this, that, talk to people within the organization, the rest of our team. And again, that's one of the strengths of having people who were SDRs for you. They can see, okay, the way I work was I did this with them, and then I had this conversation, and I did this. I'm like, okay, those are clear stages. So let's define those stages. Within our team, Beattie, who was a sales manager for us, who's an SDR for us, fantastic on both accounts. He had a lot of input in, hey, this is how SDRs work. This is how we're effective. Saskia, who's another person who came up for us. But then we also had a couple of managers come from outside the organization, and Dan and Drew and another guy named Alex now, who have all given us inputs on, oh, here's how some other people worked and here's how they thought. And so we built that really strong process. If you have that foundation, it's a heck of a lot easier to bring somebody in when you've got a strong process, whether it's an acquisition or expand into a new market or whatever you want to do, because all right, we already know how to work. Now we just need to apply that work here. And we have a pretty good idea of how much of that work is being done by current staff and would be additional staff that we might need to be able to continue to maintain what we're already doing.
I obviously have a massive bias here, but to me, it's also the documentation and the consolidation of that information in that process is so important, because as soon as it starts to become fragmented and you're like, Alex has this great idea and the other person has a great idea and the new company has this process that's working really well. And all of a sudden, if you have this fragmentation, what happens over time is they diverge and they become farther and farther apart, or it only resides in the heads of those key people. And then if you churn or if they get promoted or whatever, now all of a sudden your team is at this massive loss and you're like, wait, what do? We just kept looking to that person who knew it really well. Obvious bias, but the documentation is super important to make sure it's a company-owned process.
And again, when you think about the acquisition side of it, sometimes there is a good idea to swap human beings, like a couple of them. Like if you've got a strong core of people and you're like, okay, hey, look, we did this acquisition. I'm going to take one of these people and make them a leader over that team. The right person, I think, can have a pretty strong impact on how you do that. We actually, in one of our acquisitions lately, we did that with Tiffany, who you mentioned earlier, who was a strong leader for us. Part of her role is working on an acquisition because she understood our process, what was working there, and could bring that, teach it, coach it, and drive some performance excellence there as well.
Yeah, I love it. That's great. All right, well, Rob, thank you for coming on. I appreciate it.
It's always good to see you, man. As co-Red Sox fans, even though I'm in Michigan, I always love chatting with you, my man. So anyway, Kyle, it's always great to see you, my man. Thanks for the opportunity to come out and chat with you, buddy.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for listening to this episode of Market Mastery, brought to you by the Bridge Group. If you're a revenue leader in the B2B sales space or know someone who is, connect with me on LinkedIn. Don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on future episodes.